It was a typical morning at Riverside Middle School in Atlanta, Georgia. The air buzzed with the sound of adolescent chatter, desks scraping against the tiled floor, and the occasional laughter of students swapping stories before the start of class. In room 3002, 8th grade algebra was about to begin. Students shuffled to their seats, notebooks flopping open, pencils rolling off desks. At the back of the room, near the window, sat Jamal Carter. He was 13 years old, tall for his age, and noticeably quiet. He preferred the view outside over the routine inside. While other students whispered and giggled, Jamal's gaze followed the slow sway of the tree branches beyond the glass, his mind somewhere far away. Mrs. Amanda Thompson, the teacher, took her usual stance at the front of the classroom. A woman with years of experience and a sharp eye for potential, she ran a tight ship. She had seen all kinds of students, those who tried, those who struggled, and those who simply didn't care. And then there was Jamal. He never caused trouble, never disrupted class, but his lack of engagement gnawed at her. She didn't tolerate wasted potential. That morning, as she sorted through the most recent math tests, her lips pressed into a thin line. The scores were, as expected, disappointing. Several students had barely scraped by, while others had outright failed. But at the top of the pile was one paper, 100%. Perfect. And the name written in neat, careful letters? Jamal Carter. Her brow furrowed. How could a boy who barely looked up from the window ace a test that most of the class had fumbled through? Was it luck? A fluke? Or was there more to Jamal than met the eye? Frustration simmered beneath her professional demeanor. If Jamal thought he could drift through her class without effort while outperforming his peers, she was going to make him prove he deserved that score. Her gaze flicked toward the back of the room, where he still sat, chin resting on his hand, eyes lost in thought. "Jamal Carter," she called, her voice slicing through the classroom noise like a knife. The chatter died instantly. Heads swiveled. Even the students who had been more interested in passing notes than math turned to watch. Jamal blinked, his trance broken. He sat up slightly, his expression unreadable. "Since you seem more interested in what's outside than what's happening in here," Mrs. Thompson continued, walking toward the whiteboard, "let's see if you've been paying attention." She lifted a marker and, with deliberate strokes, wrote out an equation. It wasn't just any equation. It was far beyond anything the class had covered. Advanced. Intimidating. A problem meant to humble even the brightest of students. A murmur rippled through the room. Some students exchanged knowing glances, a few smirked. They had seen this before. A teacher calling out an inattentive student, forcing them into the spotlight, waiting for them to stumble. Jamal stared at the equation, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. His classmates expected him to struggle, to fail, to fumble his way through an answer before Mrs. Thompson dismissed him with a disappointed sigh. But Jamal knew something they didn't. He stood up slowly, pushing back his chair. The room, so full of quiet anticipation, felt suddenly smaller. He stepped toward the board, each footstep echoing louder in his mind than the last. The marker was warm from Mrs. Thompson's hand when she handed it to him. A challenge, a test, and Jamal was about to show them all exactly who he was. Before we go any further, let me ask you this. What would you do in Jamal's place? Would you step up? Would you prove them wrong? Or would you hesitate, let doubt win, and walk away? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this inspire you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep these lessons alive. Jamal's heart pounded against his ribs as he pushed himself up from his chair. The weight of expectation pressed on his shoulders, making every step toward the whiteboard feel heavier. The classroom buzzed with hushed anticipation. He could hear the whispers, the quiet snickers of his classmates. "He's gonna mess up. He never even talks. But he doesn't know where to start." Jamal forced himself to ignore them. He took the marker from Mrs. Thompson's outstretched hand. The plastic felt cool, solid in his grip. His palms were damp, but his fingers curled around it firmly. He stared at the equation on the board, a tangled maze of numbers and symbols that most of the students wouldn't even attempt. It was designed to be intimidating, to expose his supposed inattention. For a moment, self-doubt threatened to creep in. But then something shifted. His mind, always running, always searching for patterns, took over. The numbers began to make sense, falling into place like puzzle pieces clicking together. He didn't just see an equation. He saw the path to the answer. The first stroke of the marker was hesitant, almost uncertain. Then another, and another. The initial hush in the room deepened into complete silence. Eyes widened. The amused smirks began to fade. Wait, was he actually solving it? Jamal moved faster now. His strokes became more fluid, more confident. He isolated variables, rearranged expressions, simplified fractions. Each move deliberate, methodical. It wasn't just guesswork. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every calculation was precise, every step taking him closer to the answer. He didn't pause, didn't hesitate. The students who had been waiting for him to fail were now leaning forward in their seats. Their curiosity replaced their mockery. Even the ones who had whispered about him before now exchanged glances, stunned by what they were witnessing. Mrs. Thompson's arms were crossed, her gaze fixed on the board. The skepticism in her eyes had melted away, replaced by something else, surprise. She had set a trap, expecting to confirm her assumptions about Jamal. Instead, she had uncovered something she hadn't anticipated. Jamal reached the final step. With a quick flick of his wrist, he underlined the answer. The classroom remained frozen in silence. No one laughed now. No one whispered. No one even moved. Then, one voice broke the stillness. No way. It was barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to stir the room. The disbelief on his classmates' faces turned into something else. Recognition, acknowledgement, respect. Jamal stepped back, lowering the marker. His heartbeat still raced, but for a different reason now. He met Mrs. Thompson's gaze. For the first time, there was no frustration in her expression, no irritation, only curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of admiration. She studied the board, reading over his work, her finger tracing the steps he had taken. Every line, every calculation was flawless. Finally, she turned back to him. "This is correct." A murmur swept through the room. A few students clapped, hesitant at first, then growing louder. Someone whistled. A couple of kids exchanged nods, a silent acknowledgement of what they had just seen. Jamal swallowed hard, feeling the warmth rise in his cheeks. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, but something inside him stirred, a quiet pride he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Mrs. Thompson set the marker down and folded her arms again, this time with a small nod. "I think we need to have a talk, Jamal," she said, her voice softer than before. Jamal exhaled, steadying himself. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to find out. As Jamal completed the final stroke of the equation, he circled the answer and stepped back. The classroom, which had moments before been filled with quiet murmurs and low chuckles, now sat in stunned silence. The air was thick with an unspoken realization. Then, a single clap rang out. It came from somewhere near the front. Then another, and another. The sound gathered momentum, rippling through the room until the entire class was applauding. The hesitant, scattered claps turned into a full-fledged ovation. Even those who had smirked and whispered earlier were now staring at him with something new in their expressions, admiration. Jamal stood motionless for a moment, taking it all in. His heart was still pounding, but the rhythm had changed. It wasn't panic anymore. It was something steadier, something stronger. Pride. Mrs. Thompson took a step forward, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. She reached for the marker and ran a careful finger along the steps of his solution, her brows furrowing in concentration. Checking, rechecking, looking for an error, a misstep, anything that would explain what had just happened. There were none. She turned to face him, her voice quieter than before. "This is correct." A hushed murmur spread through the class. Heads turned to one another, eyebrows raised in disbelief. Even the students who had been so sure he would fail now saw him in a different light. Jamal exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just a little. It wasn't relief, not exactly. It was something else. A quiet realization settling in. They saw him now. And then came something even more unexpected. "Jamal," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice no longer sharp, no longer testing. "Why have you been hiding this?" The question caught him off guard. He shifted his weight, his fingers gripping the hem of his sweater. He could feel the eyes on him, waiting for his response. For years, he had kept his brilliance tucked away, afraid of drawing too much attention, of standing out. It was easier to stay in the background, to let people assume what they wanted. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't think anyone noticed." His voice was quiet, but steady. Mrs. Thompson's expression softened. Something had changed in her gaze. Not frustration, not impatience, but understanding. "Well," she said, offering the smallest of smiles, "it's time for that to change." The room, once filled with nothing but skepticism and doubt, now carried an energy of something new, possibility. That evening, Jamal sat at the dinner table, the events of the day still replaying in his mind. His mother, noticing his quietness, placed a gentle hand on his. "Something on your mind, sweetheart?" Jamal hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Something happened today," he began. He told them everything, the equation, the silence, the applause, and Mrs. Thompson's unexpected words. His mother's eyes shimmered with pride as she listened, her expression softening with each word. His father, a man of few words but deep conviction, nodded, a satisfied smile crossing his face. "This is just the beginning, son," he said, his voice firm but encouraging. "Don't be afraid to show the world what you can do." Jamal felt something shift inside him. For years, he had kept his intelligence hidden, afraid that standing out meant being alone. But today had shown him something different. Maybe stepping forward wasn't so bad. Maybe it was time. The next morning, as he walked into class, something was different. The usual hum of chatter didn't seem so distant anymore. Eyes met his, not with indifference, but with curiosity, even admiration. A boy he barely spoke to leaned over as he sat down. "Hey, that was pretty cool yesterday." Jamal blinked. Thanks." A girl from across the room chimed in. "How did you even do that? Like, do you just see the answer in your head?" Jamal shrugged, not used to the attention. "I just worked through it." But the questions didn't stop. More students approached him throughout the day, asking about math problems, wanting to understand the way he thought. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't just the quiet kid who sat by the window. Mrs. Thompson, too, seemed different. That afternoon, as the other students filed out of class, she called his name. He hesitated, then walked over to her desk. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday," she said. "You clearly need more of a challenge." Jamal tilted his head, unsure of where she was going with this. "There's an advanced program at the district level," she continued. "It's for students like you, students who think differently, who need more than what's in a standard classroom. I think you should be in it." Jamal's breath caught. The idea of stepping into an entirely new environment, surrounded by students who might be smarter, faster, it was daunting. But then he remembered the way the numbers had come together on the board, the way the classroom had fallen silent, the way his parents had looked at him with pride the night before. He thought about what his father had said. "This is just the beginning." He met Mrs. Thompson's gaze and nodded. "I'll do it." Walking into the advanced class for the first time, Jamal felt the familiar knot of uncertainty tighten in his stomach. The other students were already seated, notebooks open, deep in thought. Some exchanged quiet discussions, their words laced with confidence. He hesitated for just a moment before stepping in. He reminded himself he had earned his place here. The first few days were overwhelming. The problems were tougher, requiring deeper thought and quicker reasoning. These students weren't just good at math. They lived for it. Jamal found himself surrounded by minds as sharp as his own, and for the first time, he wasn't the only one who saw numbers as puzzles waiting to be solved. Slowly he adjusted. He worked late into the night, reviewing concepts, pushing himself to meet the challenge. And then something clicked. He wasn't just keeping up. He was thriving. The challenge wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. Back at Riverside, things had changed. No longer the quiet boy who stared out the window. Jamal had a presence now. His classmates, once indifferent, now sought him out. They asked for his help, not just with math but with everything. He had gone from being invisible to being the math guy. Even Mrs. Thompson had changed. Where once she had seen him as a disengaged student, she now looked at him with recognition. One afternoon, after class, she pulled him aside. "I hope you know how proud I am of you," she said. "I misjudged you, Jamal, and I've learned a lesson from this. Potential isn't always loud." Jamal nodded, understanding the weight of her words. It wasn't just about proving himself. It was about showing people that sometimes the quietest voices held the greatest depth. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, working through an advanced problem, his mother placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. He looked up to find her watching him, her eyes filled with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Jamal," she said. "The world is finally seeing what we've always known." Jamal smiled, warmth spreading through him. This was just the beginning. Jamal's journey was never just about solving an equation. It was about something bigger, potential. The kind that often goes unnoticed, overlooked by teachers, classmates, even by oneself. How many students sit in the back of classrooms, their heads low, their talents hidden? How many brilliant minds are dismissed simply because they don't fit into the traditional expectations of success? Mrs. Thompson thought she knew her students. She believed she could recognize effort, spot those who cared from those who didn't. But Jamal's quiet brilliance slipped past her, not because he lacked ability, but because he didn't demand attention. He didn't raise his hand for recognition. He didn't show off. He simply was. And that was enough for him, until the moment he was pushed to step forward. The lesson here isn't just about math. It's about the importance of looking closer, of recognizing the potential in those who don't seek the spotlight. The quiet ones. The ones who blend into the background. How often do we overlook people like Jamal, mistaking their silence for apathy, their stillness for lack of ability? Jamal didn't need a loud voice to prove his intelligence. His work spoke for him, and when given the opportunity, he proved himself not just to his classmates and teacher, but to himself. That's the real power of recognition. Not just in being seen by others, but in seeing yourself differently. We all know someone like Jamal. Maybe you've been him at some point in your life. Maybe you've seen potential in someone that others have missed. What would happen if we all took a moment to notice? If we gave encouragement instead of doubt? If we saw the people who were waiting for their moment to shine? Brilliance doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. And when the moment comes, when it finally steps forward, it shines. Have you ever felt underestimated? Have you ever seen talent go unnoticed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story could inspire someone else to step into their light. And if you believe in the power of stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because everyone deserves to be seen.